Imagine a swamp so vast and silent it feels alive. Early 1900s Louisiana. Families vanish without a trace. Wagons stand abandoned, horses left trembling, belongings untouched. No bodies, no footprints, nothing. To the terrified locals, it was as if the earth itself had swallowed people whole. But the truth was far darker. Hidden deep within the cypress and mist, a family of men had carved out their own world, isolated, inbred, and bound by rules that twisted into ritual. They weren't just surviving in the swamp. They were thriving. Their secret? A gruesome enterprise that turned neighbors and travelers into resources, processed, salted, and sold back into the very towns searching for answers. This isn't folklore. This is the real account of Louisiana's most terrifying cannibal clan, and how their empire of silence finally came undone. Before we dive into this chilling descent into darkness, quick favor. Hit that like button if you're into forgotten true history. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story, and share this video with a friend who thinks they've heard it all. Trust me, they haven't. What you're about to learn will haunt you. The Louisiana swamps at the turn of the century were more than wilderness. They were a breathing, shifting labyrinth. Cypress trees rose like ancient guardians, their roots twisting into black water, while a constant mist hung like a shroud. Travelers who braved these roads often whispered of a silence that pressed on the chest, unlike any natural quiet. It was as if the swamp itself held its breath, listening for the next victim. Families disappeared with unnerving neatness. Wagons stood abandoned, reins dangling, horses pacing in fear. Possessions were left untouched, as though their owners had simply vanished into thin air, leaving only the swamp as witness. Locals began speaking of strange forces, spirits, devils, or the swamp itself, hungry for flesh. Yet superstition only half covered the unease. Deep down, men suspected something human was behind these vanishings, something deliberate. Men gathered at church pews and general stores, trading hushed warnings. They told each other which trails to avoid, which nights felt heavier than others. Still, even convoy travel did little to settle the gnawing dread. The authorities offered excuses: bandits, wild animals, disease. But none explained the eerie pattern. Why were wagons never looted? Why did belongings remain untouched? Why did no trace of struggle ever appear? That neatness was the most unsettling clue. It was too precise, too orchestrated. Each disappearance felt less like chaos and more like a carefully planned act, and the swamp grew darker with every unanswered question. For the people of Shreveport and nearby villages, the disappearances became an open wound. Fathers clutched sons tighter, neighbors eyed one another with suspicion, and men prayed not for prosperity, but survival. Rumors spread of strange lights moving among the trees at night. Lanterns flickering deep in the mist, always too far to reach, always vanishing when approached. Whispers said those lights marked hunters at work. A stench often carried on the wind, sickly sweet, unlike any swamp decay men knew. It drifted across trails unexpectedly, lingering in the air until seasoned hunters gagged and hurried homeward without explanation. Though fear thickened, denial persisted. Men chose to believe in wild animals or bad luck rather than confront the truth staring from the shadows. Fear made them complicit in their own silence. The swamp itself seemed to encourage the illusion. Its tangled roots, endless waterways, and ever-present mist made it easy to believe the land, not people, consumed travelers. Yet something darker thrived beneath that veil. Hidden deep inside, one family of men had lived in near-total isolation for generations. They bent bloodlines back upon themselves, building a world of inbreeding, discipline, and rules twisted by years of secrecy. These men didn't see themselves as monsters. They saw themselves as survivors. Where others saw neighbors and travelers, they saw only resources, meat on the hoof, no different from deer or hogs. The silence of the swamp wasn't nature's mystery. It was their curtain. each vanishing a performance staged with ruthless efficiency, leaving nothing but abandoned wagons and unanswered prayers in their wake. By 1902, fear had reshaped daily life. Farmers avoided certain roads entirely, even if it meant longer routes. Merchants who once prided themselves on daring journeys now clung to crowded convoys. Still, the Brousard family, men alone, bound by blood and secrecy, continued thriving in that silence. Their empire of flesh expanded while the world beyond trembled, unknowing that human hands had orchestrated the horror. Looking back, the stage was perfectly set. The swamp wasn't an accomplice by chance. It was the perfect cocoon. Within its suffocating stillness, Louisiana's darkest secret began writing itself in blood. The Brousard homestead lay hidden where maps blurred into marsh. From a distance, it resembled a forgotten cluster of rotting cabins, half sunk into mud. But inside, it functioned as something far stranger and far more deliberate. 14 men lived there, bound by rules twisted into doctrine. Generations of inbreeding had collapsed kinship into a tangle where fathers were uncles, cousins were sons, and no one could truly say who belonged to whom. Their leader was Brousard, a frail-looking yet iron-willed patriarch nearing 80. His bent frame hid sharp eyes, and his words carried unquestioned authority. When he spoke, even the swamp itself seemed to still. Klaus ruled with scripture of his own making. Obedience was the first law. Silence was the second. Loyalty to blood came before all else. Any man who faltered felt punishment swift and merciless. Beneath Klaus stood his eldest son Alad, a gaunt, long-fingered man whose rasping voice carried menace. He was the enforcer, feared even among his kin. His presence alone commanded obedience without the need for threats. Another figure, Cordien, cousin to Alad, worked as the organizer. He handled rationing, trade, and the careful allocation of meat. His precision was chilling, as though running a grim business disguised as family duty. The younger men, stoic and silent, served as hunters and guards. They rarely spoke in town, but their watchful eyes unsettled anyone who met them. Outsiders sensed discipline drilled deep, like soldiers trained for shadows. Children born into the clan were treated less as sons than as resources in training. From infancy, they were conditioned to silence, to secrecy, and to regard outsiders as nothing more than prey. Generations of inbreeding carved deformities into their faces and bodies. Crooked jaws, uneven eyes, twisted limbs. But within the family, these marks were celebrated as proof of untainted blood, purity preserved against the corrupting world. Their compound functioned with eerie precision. Each man knew his role without words. One gathered wood, another salted meat, others butchered silently. It wasn't chaos, it was ritual. Together, they operated like a single organism. Strangers who glimpsed them in town noticed their odd dialect, an archaic French blended with swamp slang. The sound unsettled locals, who couldn't shake the sense of something ancient and alien echoing through their speech. Despite their poverty-stricken appearance, the family's unity gave them strength. They lived as though the swamp itself had shaped them, secretive, enduring, and dangerous. Outsiders saw shacks, but within those walls pulsed an empire of control. They shared meals in silence, salted flesh spread across rough tables. Prayer was not to God, but to blood itself. Klaus would remind them that survival required sacrifice, and sacrifice was their inheritance. Isolation had warped their morality into something unrecognizable. To them, harvesting flesh was no different than slaughtering hogs. Each man accepted his role without question, believing it part of a legacy worth preserving. While other families measured wealth in land or livestock, the Brousards measured it in discipline, secrecy, and the strength of their bloodline. Their twisted pride became a shield that justified every monstrous act. Neighbors saw only odd men trudging into town, selling neat sacks of salted meat. But behind their blank stares and quiet obedience, an industrial system of horror thrived, perfected over years in the shadows. The swamp protected them like armor. Lawmen rarely ventured into those tangles, and strangers who did often never returned. Within that cocoon, the Brousards built something that was neither family nor clan, but something darker. In Cleos's eyes, they were not a broken lineage. They were chosen, sharpened by isolation, preserved by secrecy. And as long as the swamp hid them, the silence outside would continue to deepen. By 1902, something peculiar began to stir suspicion in nearby towns. For years, the Brousards had barely scraped by, living off gardens and occasional game. Suddenly, they arrived with sacks of salted meat, perfectly prepared. At first, merchants welcomed the trade. Meat was scarce, and supplies didn't always reach swamp towns reliably. The Brousards came steadily, offering portions cut with strange precision. But unease quickly gnawed at sharper minds. Locals noticed the family had no livestock. Their land was too swampy for cattle, too tangled for hogs. Hunting couldn't explain the volume either. Yet week after week, more meat appeared from nowhere. One merchant unwrapped a portion and felt his stomach turn. The flesh looked softer than venison, lighter than boar, carrying a faint sweetness on the air. It didn't match anything he'd butchered before. Still, silence won out. Meat meant survival, and most traders preferred profit over asking questions. Fear of the swamp was heavy enough. No one wished to invite more shadows into their lives. But the children betrayed more than their elders realized. When brought to town, they lingered near butcher stalls, staring with unsettling fascination. Their eyes followed cuts of beef and pork as if comparing them. One boy, no older than 10, muttered in broken French about the tenderness of a flank, speaking with knowledge no child should have. The butcher who overheard felt his blood run cold. Whispers spread behind closed doors. Could the salted meat be something other than swamp game? Men avoided saying it aloud, as if words themselves might summon the truth. Fear kept questions buried. The Brousards, for their part, discouraged inquiry. When asked where the meat came from, a lad's rasping answer was always curt: swamp game. His tone carried enough weight to silence further conversation. Yet timing became impossible to ignore. Each time news of a vanished family spread, the Brousards' chimneys smoked thicker days later. Soon after, they returned to town with heavy sacks strapped to shoulders. A stench clung faintly to them, sickly sweet, almost familiar yet disturbingly wrong. Merchants took the meat anyway, averting their eyes, unwilling to confront the connection between disappearances and the goods crossing their counters. Fear of hunger dulled morality. Men convinced themselves it was chance, or perhaps hidden herds. To voice the darker thought that they traded in human flesh was to shatter the fragile safety of denial. Still, some nights, traders confessed unease to one another. They spoke of strange lanterns seen deeper in the swamp, of the children's eerie stares, of meat that made dogs recoil when offered scraps. Yet none dared confront the family outright. The Brousards had become fixtures, shadows moving between swamp and town. To accuse them without proof risked more than embarrassment. It risked becoming the next vanished name. In truth, the family had perfected a system. They slaughtered not in frenzy but in order, salting flesh with industrial efficiency, wrapping it in cloth, and presenting it as though born of honest labor. The swamp masked their crimes, but the townsmen's silence enabled them. Every coin exchanged for salted meat became complicity, a small betrayal of the missing whose belongings still gathered dust in abandoned wagons. Looking back, the signs blared like warnings: the sudden prosperity, the unnatural knowledge of children, the smell lingering in the air. But in those years, denial ruled stronger than suspicion. The Brousards thrived under that silence. For them, the salted meat was more than sustenance or trade. It was proof of dominance, proof that their way of life could thrive in plain sight. Among the few men unwilling to ignore the whispers was Father Gilbert Horton. A rugged priest, accustomed to hardship, he administered to rough camps and poor parishes. But the Brousards unsettled him beyond measure. Each attempt to approach their swamp domain was met by a lad at the gate. Silent, gaunt, and menacing, Alad's stare communicated more threat than words ever could. Horton's visits always ended swiftly, unanswered. Still, Horton noticed the patterns. Each disappearance near Shreveport coincided with strange stillness at the Brousard compound. Days later, heavy smoke rose from their chimneys, followed by visits to town with salted meat. The smell troubled him most. A sweetness hung faintly in the air around their land, unlike any roasting hog or deer. The odor clung to his robes long after each failed visit. Horton began recording notes secretly. He mapped missing families, marked abandoned wagons, and sketched eerie parallels between vanishings and Brousard activity. Doubt gnawed at him, but instinct insisted on something monstrous lurking beneath. One sweltering summer day in 1905, the swamp offered proof. Walking a muddy trail near their property, Horton encountered a stench so foul it made him gag. Curiosity and dread forced him forward. Rains had eroded soil from a shallow patch of ground. What surfaced wasn't animal remains, but scraps of clothing. Tiny shoes still laced, and human teeth scattered like seeds. Horton fell to his knees. He unearthed toys, too. Wooden carvings, rags stuffed into crude dolls stained dark. The evidence chilled him. These were not relics of swamp misfortune. These were remnants of the vanished families he prayed for. That night, his diary filled with trembling words. He wrote of blood, of lost innocence, of humanity stripped away. His faith faltered beneath the weight of truth, leaving him sleepless and haunted. Burdened, Horton carried his findings to Sheriff Augustus Landry, a hardened man respected across Louisiana. Landry had seen violence in all forms, yet the priest's evidence tightened his jaw with unspoken dread. The sheriff turned over the doll, fingers brushing its stained cloth. Silence stretched heavy in his office. He knew instantly. These weren't whispers anymore. They were proof, and proof demanded action. Landry organized deputies with grim determination. Entering the swamp meant more than law enforcement. It meant confronting something unholy. Each man who joined him understood the risk, but loyalty bound them together. The closer they crept toward the compound, the more the swamp seemed alive. Every rustle of reeds, every ripple of water carried menace. Even the bravest deputies admitted later they felt hunted. From a distance, the homestead looked pitiful. Rotting shacks, sagging roofs, a farm long abandoned. But the stench grew overwhelming. When deputies breached the first shed, the illusion collapsed into horror undeniable. Tables gouged by years of cuts stood beneath hooks dripping rot. Knives and saws lay scattered across stained wood. It was no farm shed. It was a killing floor perfected by practice. In another shed, barrels brimmed with salt, shelves stacked with drying flesh. The sheer scale silenced the men. This wasn't survival, it was industry. Human remains hung like trophies behind smoke-stained walls. Beyond the sheds, deputies found pits dug deep, overflowing with bones, skulls, ribs, femurs, each marked with precise cuts. No wild animals could explain it. This was systematic butchery, performed by hands trained in silence. As deputies staggered back in shock, Landry realized the scope. The Brousards hadn't stumbled into horror. They had built an enterprise, thriving beneath Louisiana's silence. And now, at last, the swamp's curtain was torn. When Sheriff Landry finally moved against the Brousards, dawn had barely broken. Deputies surrounded the compound, rifles raised. The swamp held its breath, mist curling as though it knew violence was about to erupt. The call for surrender shattered the silence. Shouts erupted in archaic French, figures scattering like startled prey. The deputies realized instantly this was no chaotic family, but a unit trained in escape. Men darted into the trees with astonishing speed. They knew trails invisible to outsiders, slipping into shadows as if rehearsed for years. The swamp itself seemed to aid their flight, swallowing them whole. Still, some were seized. Kleos, the patriarch, emerged with disdain carved across his withered face. He did not tremble, did not plead. He regarded deputies like nuisances interrupting carefully orchestrated work. Beside him, Cordienne fought viciously, spitting curses until overpowered. 5 boys were captured too, their wide eyes sharp with feral alertness, yet they clung obediently to Kleos's commands even in chains. But 7 others vanished into the swamp, swallowed by its endless labyrinth. Deputies searched in vain, chasing echoes and fleeting movement, but returned empty-handed, shaken by the feeling of being watched. Inside the cabins, horror deepened. Toys made of bones lay scattered in corners. Childlike drawings depicted hunts and butchery as play. Not madness, but indoctrination, passed down like heritage from father to son. Notebooks found in Kleos's hand chronicled each victim with chilling precision. Age, build, family size, quality of flesh, preparation notes. It was less diary, more ledger. Murder transformed into accounting, life measured like inventory. Deputies staggered from the discovery, pale and hollow-eyed. Hardened men admitted nausea, some retched openly. Landry himself confessed later he felt sick in a way no battlefield had ever made him before. Still, arrests led to trial. The courthouse overflowed with spectators, journalists, and grieving kin clutching photographs. All eyes fixed on the Brousards, the clan accused of slaughtering 42 souls beneath Louisiana's shadow. Kleos sat upright, cold amusement flickering in his eyes. When charges were read aloud, he smirked and muttered, "You forgot a few." The room fell into horrified silence at his casual arrogance. Cordienne spoke clinically, describing butchery methods with pride, correcting prosecutors on details. He spoke not as a criminal but as a craftsman, explaining process with detachment that chilled even the most seasoned jurors. The captured boys, questioned separately, revealed indoctrination. They spoke calmly of flesh as if it were no different from deer or hog. To them, outsiders' horror seemed incomprehensible, a strange misunderstanding of natural order. Experts testified about inbreeding and conditioning, explaining how isolation warped morality until unspeakable acts became routine. These men weren't insane, they argued. They were logical, but their logic had been twisted into nightmare. The jury listened in stunned silence. Some wept openly, others left the chamber pale and shaking. Yet verdicts came swiftly. Death for Kleos, life imprisonment for Cordienne, and separation for the indoctrinated boys. Kleos met his fate without remorse. On the gallows, he declared others would follow his path when necessity demanded it. His words unsettled the crowd, lingering like a curse long after the rope snapped. Cordienne lasted only 2 years in prison, wasting away from self-imposed starvation, refusing to abandon pride in his craft. His death carried no repentance, only defiance, clinging to the family's grotesque legacy. The boys' fates fractured in tragedy. Some perished young, consumed by violent tendencies they could not unlearn. Others lived longer but never shook their obsession. The swamp's shadow followed them into every corner of life. After the hangings and sentences, the swamp itself seemed unwilling to release the horror. Authorities burned the Brousard compound to the ground, flames raging for days, fed by wood soaked in years of blood. The fire left a blackened scar across marshland. Men who ventured near gagged at the lingering stench. A sickly sweetness carried miles on the wind, reminding everyone of the atrocities uncovered there. Even after the ruins cooled, floods unearthed grim remnants. Bones, buttons, toys, and trinkets surfaced again and again. Each discovery renewed old dread, proof that the swamp refused to bury the truth completely. The fugitives who escaped became phantoms in rumor. Hunters swore they glimpsed skeletal men slipping through trees. Lumberjacks found camps littered with bones later confirmed human. Some believed they carried on their hunts. By 1907, sightings dwindled, replaced by scraps of torn clothing and stains along riverbanks. Whether they perished or continued quietly, no one knew. Their legend lived longer than their bodies, feeding Louisiana's fear. For communities near Shreveport, hospitality turned fragile. Once, travelers were welcomed. After the Brousards, suspicion poisoned every gesture. If a stranger offered food or shelter, men wondered silently. Could they be hiding something? Generations carried the wound. Fathers warned sons against isolated families. Merchants avoided certain back roads entirely. The swamp, once merely treacherous terrain, became haunted in memory, not by spirits, but by the knowledge of human monsters. Those who uncovered the truth never fully recovered. Father Horton, tormented by what he had seen, requested reassignment. His notes confessed he had witnessed men turned into creatures without empathy or soul. Sheriff Landry admitted the case shook him more than any outlaw. He increased patrols of remote homesteads, vowing no hidden family would ever again grow into such an unchecked machine of horror. Dr. Manning turned trauma into study. His papers detailed how isolation, inbreeding, and warped social systems could strip morality away until monstrosity became routine. His warnings echoed beyond Louisiana, carrying lessons for generations. Despite their destruction, the Brousards left a cultural scar. Rural communities no longer trusted the silence of swamps. The stillness once natural now felt oppressive, as though shadows carried echoes of butchered lives. Men spoke their names in whispers, trading stories at campsites and church gatherings. The Brousards became legend, not as folklore, but as real proof that darkness could thrive unnoticed for years. Even decades later, belongings continued surfacing from swamp mud. Shoes, knives, watches. Each artifact pulled nightmares back to the surface. Survivors knew the land itself would forever remember what men tried to erase. The greatest horror was not supernatural. There were no demons in the swamp, only human beings who abandoned empathy. That truth unsettled men more than any ghost story could. The Brousards forced a terrible question. How thin is the line between civilization and barbarism? Their existence proved survival, twisted by greed and tradition, could justify anything, even transforming murder into industry. The silence of the swamp remains heavy to this day. Locals claim it listens, still holding memory of the screams it swallowed. In that silence, the legend of the Brousards continues to breathe. And so, the story endures. Not as myth, not as fiction, but as a brutal reminder. The true monsters of history wear no fangs or horns. They are men who chose to forget humanity,